What if the person who has hurt you most in life is not the one who rejected you, nor the one who stopped loving you, nor the one who walked away without looking back? What if the deepest wounds you carry were not inflicted by someone else at all, but by your own hand every single time you handed your peace of mind over to another person? Stay with me until the end, because what I am about to share completely changed the way I understand desire, love, and the power I have over my own life. Picture this scene. A man checks his phone for the 30th time in an hour, waiting for a message that never arrives. He has mentally rehearsed what he will say when she finally answers. He has crafted the perfect response, imagined the perfect tone, and anticipated the perfect outcome. Without realizing it, he has built an entire temple inside his head. And in that temple stands a single statue, a single person. And that person decides whether he has a good day or a bad day, whether he feels valuable or insignificant, whether he can focus on his work or ends up staring at the ceiling, wondering where he went wrong. That man is not in love, even though he believes he is. That man has handed over control of his own mind to someone who does not even know she holds that power. More than 2,400 years ago, in the streets of Athens, a rather unattractive man with a flat nose and bulging eyes walked barefoot, questioning anyone who crossed his path. He asked for no money, sought no fame, and chased no one to fill an emptiness. His name was Socrates, and his obsession was not conquest, but understanding. It is said that an oracle declared him the wisest man in all of Greece, and when asked why, he answered that he knew only one thing, that he knew nothing. That sentence, which sounds like humility, actually holds the key to everything we are going to talk about today. Because whoever recognizes his own ignorance is the only one capable of truly examining himself, and whoever examines himself is the only one capable of governing himself. We live surrounded by a narrative that sells us the idea that love cures everything, that finding the right person will resolve the emptiness we feel, that if we could just get that person to look at us the way we want, we would finally be complete. And that promise is so seductive that millions of men build their entire identity around it. They work, dress, speak, and even breathe thinking about how they will be perceived by someone else. And when that person pulls away, stops responding, or chooses someone else, their whole world collapses. Because what actually collapsed was not a relationship. It was the only structure on which they had built their worth as human beings. Socrates would have looked at this scene with a mix of compassion and bewilderment. For him, the most important question a man could ask himself was not, "Whom do I love?" but "Who am I?" And that question is not answered by looking outward. It is answered by looking inward, with the courage to sit alone with one's own thoughts without fleeing into distraction, without searching in another person for the reflection one should find within oneself. Plato, Socrates' disciple, recorded his teachings in several dialogues that are still studied in universities around the world today. In one of them, known as the Republic, the human soul is described as divided into three parts: a rational part in charge of thinking and deciding, a spirited part tied to honor, ambition, and courage, and an appetitive part related to the most basic desires, hunger, pleasure, and physical attraction. According to this view, a well-lived life is one in which reason drives the chariot, while the passions and appetites, though necessary, obey that rational guidance instead of seizing the reins for themselves. The problem arises when we reverse that order, when we let desire become the driver and reason is left behind, bound without voice or vote, watching the chariot head straight for the cliff. Think of it this way. When a man loses control of his own desires, when he desperately needs another person's approval, attention, or affection in order to feel at peace, that man has let his appetitive part take command. He no longer decides. The craving decides. He no longer thinks clearly. He thinks with hunger. And a man who thinks with hunger makes decisions he would never make when full. Decisions that sacrifice his dignity, his principles, even his time and energy, all in exchange for a crumb of validation that lasts only a few seconds before the hunger returns, stronger than before. Here is a concept I want you to hold on to for the rest of this video. Freedom does not consist in being able to do whatever one desires, but in not being a slave to what one desires. It sounds contradictory, I know, but let me explain with a simple example. A man who smokes a cigarette every once in a while, whenever he feels like it, with no real need, is free with respect to tobacco. But a man who cannot go an hour without lighting one, who becomes nervous, irritable, even desperate when he has no access to a cigarette, that man does not smoke because he wants to. He smokes because he needs to. And that is the difference between a governed desire and a desire that governs. Now, apply that same logic to a relationship, to a person you are waiting on, to a message you check compulsively. If you cannot concentrate, if you cannot enjoy your day, if your mood depends entirely on another person's response, then you do not desire her. You need her. And whoever needs has by definition lost his own sovereignty. Socrates was known to say that those who are most happy and nearest to the gods are those who need nothing. He said that happiness consisted not in having many things, but in needing the fewest things, for the gods needed nothing at all, and those who needed the least were most like them. Think about that. A man who needs another person's validation to feel whole has made himself a slave to that person. He has given away his freedom. And no one can truly love a slave. I am going to tell you something that might be uncomfortable to hear, but that you need to hear anyway. Most men who suffer over love are not really suffering over the person they lost. They are suffering over the version of themselves that only existed while that person was present. They suffer because along with the relationship, the feeling of being enough, of having a purpose, of feeling admired or desired, also disappeared. And if you think about it carefully, that is terrifying, because it means that man never truly had that sense of fulfillment. He simply borrowed it. And like everything borrowed, sooner or later, it has to be returned. Socrates taught something we would call, in modern terms, the examined life. He said that an unexamined life is not worth living. By this, he did not mean an academic exam, but the daily habit of asking why we act as we act, what motivates our decisions, and what fears hide behind our urges. A man who never stops to ask himself why he needs others' approval so badly is a man condemned to repeat the same pattern over and over, changing faces, names, circumstances, but always dragging the same unhealed wound. Stop for a moment and ask yourself this question with complete honesty. When you think about the person who attracts you, the one who occupies your thoughts, what exactly are you looking for from her? Are you looking for companionship, mutual admiration, shared growth? Or are you looking, deep down, for her to give back something you yourself have not been able to give yourself? A sense of worth, of belonging, of finally being enough. This question seems simple, but we rarely dare to answer it honestly because the answer tends to make us uncomfortable. In another of his dialogues, called Phaedrus, Plato has Socrates offer a fascinating reflection on love. There, romantic desire is described as a kind of madness, a force so powerful that it can pull the soul upward toward the highest wisdom and beauty or downward toward obsession and the total loss of judgment. The difference between the two paths lies not in the desire itself, which is natural and human, but in whether that desire is guided by reason or runs completely loose with no direction at all. Think of the analogy of the charioteer, the driver of a chariot pulled by two winged horses. One horse is noble, obedient, willing to follow reason's commands. The other is untamable, stubborn, lunging toward any object of desire without regard for the consequences. The charioteer's job, that is your job, is not to kill that wild horse because it is part of you, and denying it would be lying to yourself. Your job is to hold the reins firmly, to guide it, to channel it so that powerful impulse works in your favor instead of dragging you toward disaster. A man who has lost the reins of his own desire becomes a chariot out of control, and we have all seen or been that chariot crashing into the same wall again and again. Now I want to talk to you about another Platonic dialogue that is often misunderstood, the Symposium. In it, a priestess named Diotima explains to Socrates what she calls the ladder of love. According to this idea, love begins naturally and without any shame with attraction to a beautiful body. But if that love stays there, trapped in the physical, it becomes something small and fragile, dependent on a beauty that will inevitably fade with time. True growth happens when that love ascends, when a man begins to admire not just the body, but the soul, the character, the wisdom, the ideas, until he comes to love beauty itself in its purest and highest form. A beauty that no longer depends on a single person, that can never abandon him, that can never stop answering his messages. A man who has only learned to love the first rung of that ladder will spend his whole life terrified of losing what he loves, because the physical, the immediate, the external is always subject to change, to wear, to the possibility of loss. But a man who has climbed that ladder, who has learned to love knowledge, personal growth, and virtue, finds in romantic love a beautiful complement, not a life raft his sanity depends on. I want to pause here for a moment because there is something I need to clarify before continuing. I am not saying that desiring someone is wrong, or that feeling attraction or longing for companionship is a weakness. We are human beings, not marble statues, and it would be absurd to pretend to live without feeling. What I am saying is that there is a huge difference between desiring from fullness and desiring from lack. Desiring from fullness means you want someone in your life, but your life already has meaning without that person. Desiring from lack means you need someone for your life to have meaning, and that need, sooner or later, ends up suffocating any relationship, no matter how good the other person is, because no one can carry the full weight of another human being's identity without eventually burning out. This is where another important dialogue comes in. The Gorgias, in which Socrates argues with a group of rhetoricians about the difference between what is pleasant and what is good. According to his argument, not everything that produces immediate pleasure is beneficial in the long run, just as not everything that feels uncomfortable in the moment is harmful. A sweet tastes delicious, but it can damage your health if consumed without restraint. Physical training is exhausting, but it strengthens the body over time. The constant pursuit of approval feels pleasant the instant a message, a compliment, a look of interest arrives. But if that pursuit becomes the central axis of one's existence, it ends up eroding self-esteem. Because each time, a bigger dose of external attention is needed to feel the same as before, exactly as happens with any other form of dependency. Stop and look at your own life for a moment. How many times have you sacrificed your time, your dignity, or your principles just to hold on to the attention of someone who deep down you knew did not feel the same way about you? How many times have you changed your plans, your opinions, even the way you dress or speak, hoping to better fit what you believe the other person wants? Each of those times represents a small fragment of sovereignty you handed over in exchange for a promise of acceptance that most of the time was not even fulfilled. Socrates argued in his dialogues that the man who is a slave to his desires is worse than a beast. He said that, how can an incontinent man be any better than the dullest beast? That is harsh language, but it is meant to wake us up. A man who cannot control his own desires, who is ruled by his cravings for approval and attention, has reduced himself to the level of an animal driven by instinct. He is no longer a man. He is a creature of impulse. And creatures of impulse are not attractive. They are pitied at best and despised at worst. I am going to share with you an idea that completely changed how I understand rejection. When someone pulls away from us, stops responding, chooses another path, the instinctive reaction is to ask ourselves what we did wrong, what we are lacking, what we should have done differently. But Socratic philosophy invites us to flip the question around. Instead of asking what that relationship was missing, ask yourself what you were missing even before you met that person. Because the disproportionate pain we feel over a rejection is almost never proportional to what we actually lost, but to old wounds that rejection woke up. Insecurities that already existed long before that person appeared in your life, and that will keep existing long after she is gone until you decide to face them head on. Socrates understood that the deepest form of ignorance is not knowing oneself. He said that to be curious about things, not his concern while he was still in ignorance of his own self, would be absurd. And yet that is exactly what most of us do. We obsess over her responses, her signals, her intentions, while remaining completely ignorant of our own needs, our own wounds, our own patterns. We study her like a textbook while never opening the book of our own lives. Now, you might be wondering how all of this translates into concrete actions, because philosophy without practice remains mere pretty talk. So, let us talk about what governing oneself actually means day to day. The first step is to build a purpose that does not depend on anyone else. This means having goals, projects, and personal disciplines that give you meaning. regardless of whether you are in a relationship or not, regardless of whether the person you are interested in answers your messages or not, regardless of whether your romantic situation is the one you would want or not. A man with a firm purpose can feel sadness over a loss, can feel disappointment over a rejection, but that sadness does not completely destroy him because his identity never depended solely on that relationship. He has his own deep roots, which no outside storm can rip out all at once. The second step is learning to sit with discomfort without fleeing into an immediate distraction. When you feel the urge to check your phone for the 10th time, to write a message you know you should not send, to look for some clue about that person's life on social media, stop. Breathe. Ask yourself what exactly you are trying to soothe with that action. Most of the time, you will discover you are not looking for information. You are looking for relief from an anxiety that actually has nothing to do with that specific person and everything to do with your own relationship with yourself. The third step, perhaps the hardest of all, is practicing radical honesty with yourself. Socrates did not entertain comfortable illusions about his own ignorance. He accepted it, explored it, and turned it into the starting point of all his later knowledge. In the same way, you need to stop lying to yourself about your own patterns. If you tend to idealize people who ignore you while neglecting those who genuinely value you, acknowledge it. If you tend to confuse intensity with real connection, acknowledge it. If you tend to look for an emotion in drama and uncertainty that you mistake for passion, acknowledge it. Only when you name a pattern clearly can you begin to transform it, because what stays hidden in the shadows keeps governing your decisions without you even noticing. I want to tell you something else about Socrates' life that is rarely mentioned. He married a woman named Xanthippe who, tradition says, had a strong temperament and, according to some accounts possibly exaggerated over the centuries, argued with him frequently. Even so, Socrates never let those domestic tensions disturb his philosophical pursuit or his inner calm. It is said that he possessed a tranquility of soul that no accident, no loss, no injury, no ill treatment could ever alter. He kept his center, his calm, his philosophical purpose, without letting outside circumstances dictate his inner state. I am sharing this not to justify harmful relationships, but to show you something important. Even in his own domestic life, Socrates practiced what he taught. He remained steady because his peace did not depend on anyone else's behavior. His peace was his own. And that is a lesson every man needs to learn. I want to open a parenthesis here that matters. Nothing we have talked about so far means becoming a cold, distant person, incapable of loving deeply. Quite the opposite. A man who has learned to govern himself loves more freely precisely because his love no longer springs from desperation or fear of being alone. He loves because he chooses to love, not because he needs to be loved in order to feel whole. And that kind of love, paradoxically, turns out to be far more attractive and sustainable than love built from lack because it conveys a security, a calm, a steadiness that is almost impossible to fake. Think about the most magnetic people you have ever known. They are almost never the ones desperately chasing others' attention. They tend to be calm, centered people who have their own interests, who enjoy their own company, who do not need constant validation to feel good about themselves. That serenity does not come from indifference toward others. It comes from a healthy, stable relationship with oneself. A relationship built the exact same way Socrates built his knowledge, through constant reflection, brutal honesty, and daily discipline. Socrates said that self-control is a very great blessing to a man. He said that only the self-controlled have power to consider the things that matter most, and, sorting them out after their kind, by word and deed alike to prefer the good and reject the evil. When you have self-control, you have power. When you lack self-control, you are powerless, tossed about by every craving and every fear. Now I want to tell you about a thought experiment that I personally found revealing. Imagine that the person currently occupying your thoughts disappears completely from your life tomorrow, with no explanation, no goodbye, no possibility of contact. What would be left of you? Would you have projects to keep pursuing, disciplines to maintain, friendships to nurture, a purpose that gets you out of bed every morning? Or on the other hand, would you feel like your entire life had lost meaning, like you no longer knew what to do with your time or your energy? The answers to these questions reveal with brutal clarity how much sovereignty you actually have over your own existence. Do not feel bad if the answer makes you uncomfortable. Most of us at some point in life have built part of our identity around another person. It is a deeply human pattern, almost unavoidable at some point along the way. What matters is not having fallen into that pattern, but recognizing it and beginning little by little to rebuild your own foundations. A contemporary teacher of Stoic philosophy, a tradition that draws directly from Socratic teachings, used to say that we must clearly distinguish between what depends on us and what does not depend on us. Another person's response, their feelings, their decisions, their way of acting, will never fully depend on you. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many perfect messages you draft, no matter how much you try to be exactly what you think that person is looking for, the only thing you truly control is your own reaction, your own effort, your own discipline, your own values. When you pour all your emotional energy into something that does not depend on you, you condemn yourself to a constant roller coaster of hope and despair. When instead you pour your energy into what does depend on you, your growth, your character, your purpose, you find a stability that no external response can ever give you or take away from you. I want you to think of desire as fire. A fire well contained inside a fireplace warms an entire house, lights up the darkness, and brings people together around its warmth. That same fire, if it escapes the fireplace, if it has no limit or containment, can burn that same house to ashes within minutes. Desire works exactly the same way. Contained, directed, channeled by reason, it becomes a vital force that drives projects, fuels personal growth, and enriches human relationships. Uncontrolled, with no limit, with no reflection, that same desire can wreck the mental peace, self-esteem, and dignity of any person, no matter how intelligent or successful they are in other areas of life. Plato wrote in the Republic that he whose desires are strong in one direction will have them weaker in others. They will be like a stream which has been drawn off into another channel. When a man's desires are drawn toward knowledge in every form, he will be absorbed in the pleasures of the soul and will hardly feel bodily pleasure. In other words, when you redirect your desire toward something higher, something that builds you up rather than tears you down, you naturally become less dependent on the fleeting pleasures of external validation. You become free. Let us go back for a moment to the image we opened this video with. That man checking his phone for the 30th time, waiting for a response that will determine his mood for the rest of the day. Now that we have walked this path together, I want you to look at that scene with different eyes. That man does not need a more sophisticated seduction technique. He does not need the perfect message. He does not need to learn to be more interesting in others' eyes. What he actually needs is to take back the reins of his own chariot, to silence the outside noise for a moment and ask himself with the same brutal honesty Socrates used in the streets of Athens, who he is when no one is watching, what he truly values, what purpose he wants to build with his time on this earth, beyond any relationship, beyond any external validation. This is not a process that happens overnight. Socrates devoted an entire life to the constant examination of himself, and even he, by his own account, never arrived at a definitive absolute knowledge of human nature. What he did achieve was something just as valuable, staying true to his principles until the very last moment of his life. Even when he was unjustly condemned by an Athenian court and offered the chance to escape from prison, he chose to stay, chose to keep his integrity, chose not to betray what he believed in, even to save his own life. That is the magnitude of the self-mastery we are talking about. Not a passing technique for getting over a romantic rejection, but a complete philosophy of life that accompanies you in every decision, big or small. So before wrapping up this video, I want to leave you with a concrete task, something you can start practicing today over the next 7 days. Every time you feel the urgent impulse to seek someone's approval, to compulsively check a message, to change your behavior just to please a particular person, stop for 10 full seconds before acting. In those 10 seconds, ask yourself one single thing. Does this action come from my own fullness or from my own lack? If it comes from lack, breathe and instead choose to do something that strengthens your own purpose. Read, write, train, work on something that is entirely yours. This is not about repressing the desire for human connection, which is completely natural and valuable. It is about making sure that desire is born from a place of strength, not from a place of desperate emptiness. Over time, this simple practice will start transforming the way you relate, not only to the people you are romantically interested in, but to the entire world. You will start noticing that decisions that used to cause you anxiety are now made calmly. That responses you used to wait for in desperation are now received with serenity. That your worth as a person no longer fluctuates depending on a message, a look, or someone else's word, but stands firm, anchored in something far deeper and more stable than any external relationship could ever offer you. A man who has learned to govern himself, as Socrates taught, has power to consider the things that matter most. And the things that matter most are not her texts, her attention, or her approval. They are your character, your purpose, and your peace. Socrates died more than 2,400 years ago, but his question remains exactly as relevant today as it was then. Do you truly know who you are beyond the way others see you? Do you govern your own desires, or do they govern you? The answer to these questions will determine not only your future relationships, but the entire quality of your existence. No one can answer them for you, not even me, through this screen. Only you, in the silence of your own reflection, can begin to build that answer, one day at a time, one decision at a time, until you become little by little the steady charioteer of your own chariot, capable of loving without losing yourself, of desiring without being enslaved, of living with the dignity and clarity that belong only to those who have finally decided to know themselves. If you made it to the end of this video, comment, "I made it," and I will personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to be part of it and hit like if you enjoyed it.